must conflict forever reside within your soul? The endless struggle of violence. Old fighter, will you never surrender to the gods beyond? This nightmare is no mere dream. It is endless, a festering evil without end. Pain, terror, disorder, unceasing and alive. There is no resisting it. No force can oppose it. Escape is the only answer. The Odyssey. James, your tireless questions about the Byron House affair have finally stripped away the last layer of silence I once wrapped around the matter. Though I have warned you repeatedly over the years, if you insist on knowing the truth of that cursed house and that dreadful night, then continue reading. Still, I beg you not to. Some truths belong buried in ash and rubble and the twisted remains of that hideous structure. Writing this is no simple task. Even now, thinking of that night sends a chill crawling across my skin. The memories alone threaten to unhinge my mind, haunted as it is by what might still dwell beneath that shattered place. Though my experience was confined to that single night, it suggests something far greater, an unseen gathering of nightmare realms festering in the world's shadows. Darkness hides within the strange folds of the cosmos, in those vast and hollow spaces beyond light and name. I destroyed every diary page, every letter exchanged with occultists, rogue scientists, and the curious minds I once contacted. The only remaining record is this very letter. With all documents gone, I now rely only on memory, faded, broken, uncertain. The truth is, much has vanished from my mind, and what little remains feels like the half-dreamed illusions of a sick and haunted brain. Perhaps it is a mercy for us both. Now, I will recount the grim events that drove me to douse the attic of Byron House in fuel and reduce it to ash, leaving behind no living soul except one. You might recall my deep interest in mental illness and the twisted hold it exerts on its victims, a grim curiosity I once found fascinating. In my younger days, before I ever earned the title of doctor and was still caught in the relentless grip of academic demands, I worked as an orderly at Byron House. Back then, it wasn't just a job to cover my university expenses. It was a chance to peer into the shadowy realm of insanity and delusion. Byron House had once been a retirement home, closed under mysterious circumstances, only to be reopened privately by a certain doctor, Samuel Monroe, as a facility for the mentally disturbed. I had known of the house long before I ever stepped foot inside as a worker. In Barton, everyone did. During my childhood, it stood as the perfect haunted mansion for me and my group of mischievous companions. While my friends treated it as nothing more than a source of cheap scares, mocking the residents and staff before running off, I found myself drawn to it with a chilling, almost magnetic dread. It wasn't ghosts wrapped in chains or whispering spirits that fueled my curiosity. No, the real phantoms of Byron House were wrapped in the sagging, pale skin of the elderly who once roamed its halls. I used to watch them silently from behind the hedges as they wandered the garden, appearing as though they waited patiently for death. Their frailty, their ghost-like presence in the open daylight, enthralled me. I spent countless hours just observing them, captivated by the slow decay of life. I once swore I'd never let age take hold of me. I promised myself that I would die while still young and vibrant rather than decay in a place like Byron House. But the years passed, and I broke that promise. More than once, I thought of ending my life, but some instinct always pulled me back. I started working there full of hope and curiosity, a bright, eager student searching for real-world knowledge. There were 12 patients, each tormented by a mix of delusions, mental fractures, and deep psychosis. A team of 8 staff members managed their care, led by the stern and elusive Dr. Monroe. At the lowest level were orderlies like myself. The mental conditions among the patients ranged from hysteria to monomania, psychopathy, and varying levels of intellectual disability. The staff, too, were a mixed lot. William stood out, a hulking figure built for restraining the violent. There were whispers that he beat patients when no one was watching. Then there was Jane, calm but weary nurse in her late 40s, part of a government nurse training program. She often offered advice about medication. There was no compassion in her voice when she spoke of the patients. I always wondered what had led her to choose such a path. And above them all loomed Dr. Monroe, a man shrouded in distance and severity. I always sensed that he harbored some quiet disdain for his role at Byron House. He rarely left the confines of his office, keeping to himself as much as possible. Alongside Dr. Monroe, Jane, and Williams, there were a few recent hires, some university students like myself, and a handful of local men whose only real usefulness came from their ability to handle difficult patients with brute strength. I regret that I can no longer recall their names or faces, despite the profound effect the house would have on my life. Fortunately, my time at Byron House was not long. I had been told there were 12 inmates, and for a while I believed that to be true. However, through quiet whispers and the murmurings of other staff, I soon discovered there was a 13th patient. This individual was unlike the others, requiring Dr. Monroe's full attention and constant supervision due to the severity of his condition. His name, I came to learn, was Jonathan Spencer, but to the staff, he was simply referred to as 13. He lived alone in the attic, an area specially renovated for his confinement. Unlike the other patients who occasionally saw visitors or went on supervised outings, 13 was never allowed outside. He remained confined to the attic at all times, and no staff members except Dr. Monroe were allowed on the top floor. Jane once shared a story about a younger woman who had taken a night shift at the house some years before. On a night when Monroe had traveled to deliver a lecture in Manchester, the woman had been left alone in the house. She heard loud noises coming from the attic, 13 moving around. Against strict instructions, she went upstairs to check on him. Whatever she witnessed caused her to flee the house in terror, never to return. After that incident, Monroe grew even more secretive and cautious, often spending the night at the facility to prevent any further intrusions. Jane, though not fond of him, was relieved that Monroe kept close to Spencer, as it meant she never had to interact with the man in the attic. According to Jane, Spencer had already been living in that room before she began working there, which had been many years ago. Williams rarely spoke of 13, but when he did, he hinted that the inmate's problems were more physical than psychological, that his body was twisted or abnormal in some way. Despite Williams' size and confidence, he became noticeably uneasy when assigned duties on the upper floors. Though Monroe frequently used Williams to manage violent outbursts among the other patients, even he was barred from going near the attic. Among us orderlies, 13 was a constant topic of hushed conversation and speculation. None of us had ever seen or heard him directly, and aside from the single terrifying experience I would later face, none of us ever would. My curiosity about the attic and its mysterious resident grew steadily, but Monroe remained fiercely protective, almost obsessively so, regarding Spencer's care. Anytime I tried to offer my assistance, the doctor dismissed me with nothing more than a disinterested wave of his hand. By chance or fate, I was granted entry into that eerie, secluded world where few others had ever set foot, and it happened far sooner than I had imagined. It was December, and I had been working at the house for just under 2 months when Jane entered the staff room one morning, holding a cup of coffee and a cigarette pack. Her face was pale and visibly disturbed. I hadn't known she smoked until that moment, but she didn't hesitate, lighting a cigarette as she collapsed into the chair across from me. She didn't speak right away. In fact, she didn't even acknowledge me. She just sat there in silence, her expression fixed in a daze, occasionally sipping from her cup or dragging deeply from her cigarette. I tried to concentrate on the article I had been reading, but my eyes kept drifting back to her wide, unmoving stare. "All right," I finally said, folding my paper and setting it aside. "What happened? What's wrong?" Despite the gap in our positions, Jane and I had formed a blunt but friendly rapport. She finished her cigarette, lit another almost immediately, and then finally spoke. "I had the night shift," she said, "covering for someone who called out." "Who?" I asked. "Monroe. He's sick, caught some kind of virus, and they don't want it spreading to the inmates. Especially," she broke off mid-sentence, "13, I guess." She didn't respond with words, but gave a slow, weary nod. I didn't push her for details. It was clear that whatever she had encountered the night before, she wasn't ready to talk about it. For a while, we sat in silence. My mind turned over what I'd just heard. This was it. This could be my opportunity. My curiosity about 13 had grown stronger each day, and with Monroe out sick, the door had cracked open. "So," I said suddenly, making Jane flinch slightly, "you're on duty again tonight?" She nodded without much energy, clearly dreading the idea. "I could take the shift for you. I really wouldn't mind. I've asked Monroe before if I could be involved with 13's care. You see, I'm working on a paper for school." She stood up suddenly, cutting me off. "Seriously? You'd really do that? You wouldn't mind?" "Not at all. I know Monroe probably asked you because you're senior, but still, I'm not sure how happy he'd be if he found out we swapped." She paused briefly before answering. "All right, I won't say a word if you won't. I can just give you the money straight from my wages." "No need to adjust the schedule," I agreed with a nod. "It's settled. You finish up early, and I'll stay to handle the night shift," I added. "I might just need to swing by my place to grab a change of clothes, but I live nearby. It won't take long." The visible relief on her face was both comforting and unsettling. It felt good to help, but deep down, I knew that if I followed through with this plan, I wouldn't be getting any restful sleep that night. Her mood improved drastically for the rest of the day, and she kept herself busy, planning to head out just before 7 p.m. She kindly gave me a checklist of the tasks required for the night, and I spent the remainder of the afternoon attending to my regular duties. I don't think the full weight of what I'd agreed to had hit me yet. More than anything, I was filled with anticipation, but As the December sun dipped below the horizon and the last of the staff trickled out, Jane included, the reality of the situation finally began to settle in. William, on his way out, shot me a cold, knowing look that lingered long enough to unsettle me. I couldn't help but wonder if he had some idea of what lay ahead for me, judging by the remarks and taunts he'd thrown my way earlier in the day. I had never worked the overnight shift before. Others had, of course, and although they grumbled about 13's strangeness, they always mentioned how reassuring it was to have Dr. Monroe around. Just knowing another sane person was in the building brought comfort, and the added benefit was that Monroe, being a medical professional, could step in if anything unexpected occurred. As the hours dragged on and each inmate was secured in their respective rooms, a stifling sense of isolation began to close in on me. The building felt heavier somehow, more silent than I had anticipated. At 9 p.m., I set about preparing Spencer's meal and medication, following Jane's notes precisely. His dinner was simple: a plate of scrambled eggs and a glass of fresh orange juice with a straw. The medications were equally straightforward: some basic painkillers, dietary supplements, and allergy tablets. Nothing in the list suggested any psychiatric or mood-related treatment. That stood out to me. It became increasingly clear that whatever condition afflicted 13, it wasn't a mental illness. It appeared to be a physical affliction, something incurable, something that could only be managed, not healed. As I carried the tray upstairs, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer he had left, if his condition was truly medical in nature. I reached the third-floor landing and paused briefly, listening carefully for any sign of noise from the other rooms. After a few moments of stillness, reassured that everything remained quiet, I pressed on. This was the closest I had come to the attic since beginning my work here, and the idea of going further filled me with a quiet fear. I tried to clear my mind and shake off the unease as I climbed toward the final staircase that led to the secluded attic room. The stairs from the third floor rose in a straight line before curving slightly to the left. As I ascended, they became tighter, and the ceiling appeared to lower and close in around me, giving the space a suffocating feel. I halted as the curve sharpened, revealing the entrance to room 13. I was just 10 steps from the aged wooden door. Once painted white, most of the paint had chipped off, exposing the original oak beneath in wide, flaky patches. Jane's description was accurate. A small flap had been hacked into the bottom and reattached, just big enough to slide a tray through. The door stood alone at the top of the stairs, strangely spectral in appearance. I had only ever heard of it through whispers, but now it stood real before me, quiet and unsettling. I had taken only one step when I heard movement from the other side, movement that could only be described as grotesquely expressive. First came a dull thump, as though something had dropped from a short height. It was muffled, likely cushioned by something soft. Perhaps Spencer rolling off his bed under thick blankets, I had thought. Yet there was a moist, unpleasant undertone to the sound that left me uncertain. Next came a dragging noise, low and deliberate, accompanied by heavy breathing. It grew louder as I remained still, inching closer with slow, dreadful intention. Whatever was in the room seemed to be creeping toward me at a disturbingly unhurried pace. Fear gripped me, but my mind fought to remain logical. Driven by a strange mix of fear and curiosity, I climbed the last steps and placed the tray before the door. Then, lowering myself flat against the staircase, I brought my head down to the narrow gap under the door, barely half an inch wide. What I saw will stay with me forever. Staring back were a pair of swollen, red-rimmed eyes. I don't recall fleeing down the stairs, but I do remember reaching the ground floor bathroom and throwing up. It may seem like an overreaction, but there was something truly disturbing about those eyes. Perhaps it was the unusual distance between them, or the way they rolled, loose and slow in their sockets. I couldn't shake the image of a frog or toad, the closest my brain could come to identifying what I had seen. I spent the rest of my shift in the staff room, nursing a cup of coffee and waiting for the first light of day to break through. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things, ready to hand over my duties to Jane and the incoming morning staff. As she approached, I didn't say much when she asked how the night had gone. I offered a faint smile and a quick, "It was fine," before hastily leaving the building and heading home. By sheer coincidence, my week of shifts ended the next day, and I took the opportunity to isolate myself at my apartment. I slept a lot, though I didn't feel any sense of rejuvenation. Those eyes haunted me, lingering in my thoughts, and I was plagued by unsettlingly vivid dreams for days. When I returned to work a few days later, I kept myself, burying my head in my coursework in the staff room. I didn't mind solitude, and no one disturbed me, as I focused intensely on my books and papers. But despite the distraction of my studies, that night remained imprinted on my mind. Dr. Monroe was still absent due to illness, and I assumed the rest of the staff had covered the night shifts in his absence. No one, however, spoke of anything unusual happening during that time. In spite of the shock, I found myself strangely fascinated. I felt as though I had witnessed something both terrifying and revealing, and my mind was overwhelmed by a mix of horror and curiosity. Those eyes haunted me, constantly resurfacing in my thoughts. What kind of condition could cause such grotesque deformity? If I could somehow communicate with Spencer, especially with Dr. Monroe out of the picture, perhaps I could make him the subject of my academic work. At the very least, I hope to uncover a rational explanation that would help me make sense of what I had witnessed. After a few days of going through my usual rounds, I had made up my mind. I approached Jane and explained that with Dr. Monroe still unwell, I would like to take over her night shifts in the house. Similar to the arrangement before, she agreed without hesitation, and my next shift began that very night. As I prepared the evening meal and medication to bring up to the attic, I focused on my renewed purpose. This time, the meal was straightforward: mashed potatoes and a cup of milky tea with a straw. I couldn't help but feel distaste for the meal, wondering if Spencer ever grew weary of the bland, repetitive food Dr. Monroe had arranged for him. All the meals seemed designed for someone with minimal ability to eat. It felt more like food meant for an infant than an adult. Soft puddings, mashed vegetables, and liquid-based meals. Nothing substantial. With newfound determination, I set off towards the attic with the tray, this time without hesitation or pause. As I reached the final staircase, something unusual awaited me at the door. It wasn't the terrifying or grotesque object I had imagined, but rather something that immediately made me question its place and time. It was a small, plain sheet of paper, slightly wrinkled and folded awkwardly a few times, sticking out from the gap beneath the door. The room behind the door was silent, and I assumed that 13 must still be asleep. I carefully slid the tray through the flap, taking care not to disturb the occupant, and retrieved the note along with the breakfast tray left by the morning staff. Quietly, I descended back to the staff room. I couldn't bring myself to read the note during the night. I feared it might disturb my peace of mind and disrupt my ability to work. I placed the note in my bag, noticing a strange, dampish gleam on its surface. Trying to focus on my university work, I resisted the urge to read the note, though my eyes often wandered to the bag, tempted to peek inside. When morning arrived, I quickly handed over my duties to the morning staff and hurried home. Normally, I'd head straight to bed, but today I brewed a large pot of coffee and toasted some bread. Carrying my breakfast and the note to my study desk, I opened the blinds, letting the weak December sun light up the room, then sat down and carefully unfolded the paper. I can't say the writing was anything more than a childish scrawl at first glance, and I doubted there was anything significant in those uneven letters. But after several minutes of focused study, transcribing some of the words onto a fresh sheet, I managed to piece together enough to read. As I mentioned before, I've since destroyed any physical records of these events, but I still recall the contents of that note. I apologize if I frightened you the other night. Please don't feel guilty for finding my appearance unsettling. I've grown used to such reactions over time. I assume that Dr. Monroe, for reasons unknown, is unavailable to care for me, which is why I have seized this opportunity to finally reach out to another person. I apologize for the crude and awkward writing, but my condition makes delicate tasks difficult. I ask for your patience. I won't burden you with the full details of my situation nor the reasons for my confinement here. I admit, I don't know where I am or how much time has passed since I arrived, but that no longer seems to matter. If the necessary precautions aren't taken, I won't last much longer, and if that happens, it can only mean that Monroe has accomplished his ultimate goal. Understand this: the man known to you as Dr. Samuel Monroe is not who he seems to be. In our youth, we were inseparable friends, close, the best of companions, you might say, and together we explored many of the forgotten corners of the world. We traveled to the Orient, the Congo, and Arabia. We ventured deep into the jungles of the Indian subcontinent, the sands of ancient Egypt, and the lost ruins scattered across the Americas. My condition, though, is linked to those travels, but it is far darker and more sinister than any mere tropical disease. Now, I need two things from you, if I may be so bold. I understand that you are under no obligation to help me, but if you do, you will not only be aiding me, but also safeguarding the future of humanity. First, I must ask you to keep our communication secret. No one, not even Monroe, can know that we have been in contact. That man is malevolent and will harm you if he discovers that you have spoken with me. Second, I need you to acquire some items that have been taken from me. I believe they are in Monroe's possession. I will provide more details once I receive a response from you. Only then can we proceed with what needs to be done. I am grateful to whatever forces brought us together and eagerly await your reply. The note was captivating. I read it over and over again, my coffee and toast completely forgotten as a flood of questions began to churn in my mind. I couldn't be entirely sure it was meant for me, but somehow I became convinced it was. The contrast between the eloquent writing and its crude presentation was striking, but it was clear that it came from a sharp and insightful mind. Though the writer seemed highly intelligent, it was evident that Spencer was troubled in some way. There was no doubt that the letter cast a sinister light on Dr. Monroe's behavior. What kind of evil was Spencer suggesting the doctor was involved in? True, Monroe was cold and unapproachable, but would he really go so far as to harm me if he found out I had communicated with Spencer? I couldn't bring myself to believe it. At that moment, I was convinced that the whole issue of Spencer's animosity toward Monroe was nothing more than a delusion, a fantasy concocted by Spencer in the isolation of his attic confinement. Given Spencer's mental state, I began to wonder if it wasn't natural for someone in his position to project such a demonic image onto the person he viewed as his captor. Whether it was a fantasy or not, I resolved to follow his advice and keep our communication secret from Dr. Monroe, not out of fear, but because I wanted to retain my job. I wrote a response that morning, which I delivered to Spencer when I began my next night shift. In my reply, I agreed to hear him out, but only if he would fully explain his illness, so that I might use that information for the advancement of medical science. Of course, deep down, I was hoping this would present me with a rare case to focus my academic pursuits and career on. And I had a strong sense that Spencer suspected this. Before slipping my reply under the door, I tried to make verbal contact. I pressed my ear against the door and simply said, "It's me. I got your note." There was no answer. I continued, "How did you know I would get it? Can you hear me?" My last question was abruptly interrupted by a low, gurgling sound like liquid bubbling up from somewhere deep. The response made my stomach turn, and I quickly fled the scene, retreating to the staff room where a cold sweat kept me from getting any meaningful rest. The following morning, before the day staff arrived, I rushed back upstairs. To my relief, another note awaited me. This one was shorter than the first, and since I was now more familiar with his handwriting, I was able to read through it quickly before the morning shift began. "I'm overwhelmed that you will help me. I'm not sure you're fully ready for all that I have to share, but for your sake as well as mine, you must be. Before we proceed, though, I must clarify a few things. Last night, I tried to respond to your questions, but as you probably heard, my ability to speak has atrophied to the point of being useless. I appreciate your genuine interest in my condition. While I'm flattered that you would want to offer treatment or a cure, I'm afraid I am beyond help. A bath in the waters of Lake Harley in Carcosa, or the remedies of the star scientists from the far-off world of Yugoth might be of no use to me. No earthly treatment can help me now. This affliction is a punishment delivered by harsh forces that occasionally take interest in our kind, always to our suffering, never our benefit. I am beyond saving, but I thank you for the offer. The items I mentioned in my previous letter are crucial. First, my diary, which I kept up until my confinement, and secondly, a manuscript. The latter holds the greatest importance. The title is De Verm Mystery. Both the diary and manuscript are believed to be in Monroe's home. Spencer urged me to retrieve them as quickly as possible. The following days were excruciating. I knew Spencer wanted me to break into Monroe's house, but I couldn't decide if I was willing to commit a crime just to fulfill his request. It was clear that Spencer's mind was unwell, that much was undeniable. But despite his delusions, I still had a strong desire to learn more about him. His condition, I was convinced, had the potential to advance medical understanding, but Monroe's continuous confinement of Spencer prevented the medical world from offering him any real help. I wasn't prepared to commit burglary at the behest of a man who may very well be mad, especially considering Monroe was still out due to the virus. The idea of sneaking into his house at night seemed too risky. There was no reason to visit him socially, and I doubted he would even recognize me as a colleague. That was just the way he was. I continued to write letters to Spencer, keeping things casual and avoiding a direct answer to his request. Instead, I probed further into the history of Spencer and Dr. Monroe. Eventually, Spencer grew frustrated, and our correspondence shifted into hostile exchanges. Spencer's illness seemed to worsen, and his anxiety became more evident. I wasn't in any rush to make a decision about retrieving his manuscripts, which only provoked more angry letters from Spencer. At times, I considered abandoning the whole matter and returning to my previous work at the university. I even thought about leaving Byron House for good. But before making any decisions, I decided to do some research on my own, without informing Spencer. I didn't have much to go on, but I traveled to the nearby town of Eastwich and visited their small library. I searched for any mention of the lake, Holly, Carcassa, Ugoth, and De Vermis mysteries, along with all the other strange terms from Spencer's letters. I found nothing on Lake Holly or Ugoth. No geographical, historical, scientific, or astronomical texts made any reference to these terms. However, I had more luck with De Vermis mystery. It turned out to be a cursed and forbidden book, written in 1542 by Ludwig Prynne, shortly before he was executed by the Inquisition. Over time, many copies and translations of the book had been made, with some versions given strange titles like the Grimoire or the Saracenic Rituals. The original Latin title, however, ominously translated to The Mysteries of the Worm. The book seemed to be one of a series, with each volume more horrific than the last. Other works were referenced within, including titles like Colt de Ghouls, Things of the Water, and the dreaded Necronomicon. These books spoke of ancient times when the earth was ruled by old ones and elder things, of alien fungi from Ugoth, faceless night gaunts dressed in black with 1,000 young, and a great Cthulhu who lay dead yet dreaming in the sunless, brine-filled world of R'lyeh. Though much of the content was beyond my understanding, there was a palpable sincerity in the descriptions that were as terrifying as they were incomprehensible. I dismissed such thoughts from my mind. After all, I considered myself a man of reason and science, not of dark arts. Yet, despite my best efforts to rid myself of these ideas, they continued to haunt my imagination, lingering in my thoughts every day thereafter. During my research, I found a brief passage in a recently published book on witchcraft, detailing the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. It mentioned a man named John Dee, a sorcerer and author of works like Monus Hieroglyphica and notes on the mysteries of the worm. The book's author, Dr. Harlan Glass, was noted in the text, and I made sure to write him a letter the next day, asking if he knew anything about a book titled Divermis Mysteries. However, I never received a response. What kind of forbidden knowledge had Spencer and Dr. Monroe delved into? I had always thought of Dr. Monroe as a rational man, but according to Spencer, Monroe had once been deeply involved in the study of the supernatural, exploring strange and dark realms. The days spent in the library left my mind exhausted, and I returned to my apartment hoping for a restful night's sleep. But my dreams were far from peaceful. I was plagued by recurring nightmares, visions of the first time I had witnessed Spencer's unsettling eyes. These dreams were filled with chaotic, swirling vortices that scorched my mind, and I found myself drifting aimlessly in the vast, empty void of space. I didn't know how I ended up there, but I had a sense of being bodiless, carried by something so ominous that I dared not look at it. The sound of massive wings beating echoed in my ears. Though I couldn't tell where I was in the cosmos, I instinctively knew that I was heading toward lightless Yugoth, the haunting home of the terrible fungi sentinels. The scene in my nightmare shifted, and I found myself standing at the shore of what I somehow knew was Lake Holly in Carcosa. The water, dark purple and thick like syrup, lapped around my ankles, releasing the fetid odor of countless decaying bodies. Something massive and grotesque rotated slowly at the center of the lake, an enormous, disturbing mass of plastic-like flesh. To my horror, it bore a face, a cruel mockery of a face, and eyes that resembled Spencer's own, swollen and bulging. I woke with a start, screaming and gasping for air. Sweat soaked my sheets, and my head pounded painfully. I took a week off from work to recover, but the nightmares continued to torment me night after night. December eventually came to a close, and Christmas passed quietly, with little celebration on my part. I wasn't one for the festive season, spending most of the time alone in my apartment or at the local pub. When I returned to Byron House, I discovered that Dr. Monroe had also resumed work and appeared much healthier, having finally recovered from the virus. He was back to his usual distant, aloof self, and though I felt a sense of relief, his return meant that any further contact with Spencer was now impossible, something even he would have to accept. As it turned out, he was just as wary of Monroe discovering our contact as I was. I didn't hesitate for long. By this point, my obsession with uncovering the secrets of Divermis Mysteries had grown uncontrollable. I never once believed that the bizarre things I had witnessed in my dreams or read about in books on necromancy and witchcraft were real. Instead, I viewed them as a key to understanding Spencer better. My desire to write a paper on him, especially delving into his mysterious interest in the supernatural, had been reignited. I was certain I could craft a groundbreaking study on supernatural monomania, one that I could proudly hand over to my tutor. I had finally decided to follow through with Spencer's wish and steal his diary and manuscript. Not to return them to him, of course, but for my own private study. Once I had finished my examination, I could simply sell the book and make a bit of money from it. By all accounts, it would fetch a high price from the right collector. I was aware that my time at Byron House was quickly coming to an end, with the first semester exams approaching, and I would have to quit my job to focus on my studies. Soon enough, I would be away from Monroe and Spencer, returning to the normal life of a student. Driven by my insatiable thirst for knowledge, I decided that breaking the law was a risk worth taking, and began planning my theft. I started following Monroe home on my days off. Despite his recovery, he rarely stayed the night at Byron House, likely still wanting the comfort of his own bed as he continued his recuperation. This, of course, made things more complicated, but I knew that his stubbornness would eventually cause him to slip back into his old routine. I made it a point to observe him from a distance, learning his habits and routines. Fortunately, he did exactly as I expected and began spending more time at Byron House. Finally, I chose a night to break into his house. It was an icy January evening when I set out for Monroe's large detached house on Town Court Lane. The night was cold and clear, with the moon and stars shining brightly, bringing back the eerie memories of my recent nightmares. I don't want to dwell on the details of my break-in, and I'm certainly not proud of it. Despite my lack of experience, I managed to scale the tall brick wall behind his house. Using my jacket to shield my hand, I smashed the small glass pane in the kitchen door. I wasted no time and took out my flashlight, methodically searching the downstairs rooms. It didn't take long before I stumbled upon a study. The air was thick with the pungent scent of musk, likely from the many stuffed animals and ancient books that crowded the shelves. The shelves were overloaded, groaning under the weight of hundreds of heavy volumes, and the room itself seemed to sag under the burden of its contents. I scoured the largest bookshelf, carefully searching for the tome I needed. The books were disorganized, piled haphazardly on top of each other. Amid the more mundane works on history, anthropology, and geography, I noticed several dark and ominous titles that I had previously come across at the Eastwich Library. Among them were Unaussprechlichen Kulten von Junst, Comte de Letz, Culte der Gules, and the dreaded Selenio fragments. Most of these forbidden works seemed to be modern translations, though at least one of them appeared to be an authentic, ancient text. It didn't take long before I found De Vermis Mysteries. I carefully slid the decaying manuscript from its shelf, the other books tumbling softly into the empty space left behind. I doubted Monroe would even notice the missing volume amidst the chaos, but I made sure to rearrange the books so that no noticeable gaps remained. Then I spotted a smaller, black-bound book tucked behind the manuscript. A quick check revealed it to be Spencer's diary. I silently admired Monroe's sense of organization. Despite the disarray of his collection, he seemed to understand the importance of both Spencer's diary and the notes on the manuscript. Unable to curb my curiosity, I opened De Vermis Mysteries and skimmed over the intricate text inside. Unfortunately, the manuscript was too complex, written in archaic Latin, so I turned my attention to the more readable, though equally cryptic, journal. Monroe had not yet returned, and with no nearby neighbors to worry about, I sat at the study desk, flashlight in hand, and began to read. The journal chronicled the travels of Monroe and Spencer during their youth. It appeared that Spencer had been true to his word in the letter describing their adventures. The diary recounted their encounter with an ancient cult while they were in Central Asia, in a place, or perhaps even a time, known only as Leng. It also mentioned a secret order of monks who had guarded a magnificent treasure within a vast stone monastery. The treasure, a large golden idol of a winged hound, was a powerful artifact capable of unlocking a pathway for the Old Ones, entities trapped beyond our reality. The monks had devoted themselves to protecting the treasure from all who would steal it, including the Chocho, ferocious, semi-human cannibals, and the terrifying spiders of Leng, sentient arachnids with their own dark agenda for humanity. Monroe's interest in the cult seemed to revolve around opposing the old ones in some way. Spencer, on the other hand, seemed far more intrigued by the cult's arcane powers. As I continued reading, I discovered more about their dealings with the monks and the secrets of immortality that could be bestowed upon outsiders. It appeared that Spencer had indeed achieved his goal of meeting the immortal leaders of the cult, but the encounter had gone terribly wrong. In retaliation, Spencer decided to take the golden idol for himself and escape. Monroe, though reluctant, had no choice but to accompany him, driven by the guilt of being connected to Spencer's actions. On their journey back to England, the two men found themselves in constant conflict over the fate of the idol. Monroe wanted to rid themselves of the cursed object, but Spencer adamantly refused, believing that the dark secrets contained within the idol would grant them eternal life as gods. Eventually, the two parted ways, with Monroe keeping the idol and Spencer left with nothing. Spencer's paranoia grew as he became consumed by the belief that either the cult or Monroe had cursed him. He spoke of strange symptoms that seemed to match the condition he was now suffering from. I searched desperately for the idol, which had been meticulously sketched in Spencer's diary, but my efforts proved in vain. I suspected Monroe might still have it hidden somewhere, perhaps in his house, or even at his office in Byron House. Regardless, I knew it was time to leave. After reading Spencer's journal, I slept poorly. My nightmares intensified, and I felt as though I was being drawn into an abyss, my soul tormented by every horrifying revelation the diary had exposed. On the morning of my final shift at Byron House, I sat, staring at an untouched cup of coffee, reflecting on everything I had read in recent weeks. Although I still considered the ideas of magic, ancient gods, and forbidden realms to be mere fantasy, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that lingered. If everything in Spencer's journal was true, it seemed that Monroe had prevented Spencer from achieving immortality and had locked him away to prevent any further harm. However, the nightmares continued to drain me. I felt mentally exhausted, and my studies were suffering. I began to think that if some deranged individual wanted their book back, who was I to refuse? It would be easier to simply rid myself of these cursed objects and forget about the whole affair, returning to the safety of my academic life. In secret, I had considered returning the books to Monroe's house, but it became apparent that he knew about the break-in, likely due to the broken window I'd left behind. I heard rumors that he had acquired a large German shepherd to guard his home. Keeping the books would only incriminate me further. I could have disposed of them, but that felt reckless, considering the dangerous knowledge they contained. I knew that my fingerprints would be all over the books, and selling them had originally seemed like a good plan. However, I began to question who would want such a dangerous item and for what purpose. Even if I sold them, I couldn't shake the worry that they could eventually be traced back to me. Perhaps I was being overly cautious, but at that time, I couldn't risk the chance, no matter how slim, that I might somehow be connected to criminal activity. So I quietly slipped the manuscript in Spencer's diary into one of my folders and headed to work. When the opportunity arose, With the other staff occupied and the usual bustle slowed down, I made my way to the attic. After a brief pause, I placed both the diary and the De Verman mysteries by the door, knocked once, and hurried away. From that point on, I worked sporadically at Byron House. Although I had planned to quit, I ended up taking a few extra shifts, unable to turn down the money. I managed to balance the work with my studies by sticking to day shifts. Gradually, the nightmares ceased, and I found myself getting the rest I needed. With my exams approaching, I started to feel like things were returning to normal. However, I couldn't help but notice a disturbing change in Monroe. He seemed to be under immense stress, growing weaker by the day. The illness that had previously affected him seemed to be back, and I even saw him cough up blood into his handkerchief. His once lively demeanor had faded, replaced by a somber and anxious air. Dark rings formed under his eyes and deep wrinkles began to appear on his face. It was as if he was not just physically ill, but also consumed by a deep worry. He became more subdued than usual, even trying to engage in light conversation with the staff in a weary and resigned manner. Eventually, his health deteriorated to the point where he had to leave work for good. A few days later, we received the news of Dr. Monroe's death from heart failure. It wasn't entirely surprising given his age and the recent stress he had endured, but it still sent a chill down my spine. Monroe's death weighed heavily on my mind, especially considering the suspicion I had. If my fears were correct, I may have played a role in his demise. Spencer's involvement with that cursed manuscript had only added to the horror of the situation. James, we're approaching the end of my story now. I realize it has taken longer than I initially intended, and I admit that I may have dragged it out. But I had to, because I dread writing what I must. It is the only way you will understand, just as I did when I first began this account. Now, I must urge you to stay far away from this matter. Forget everything about the occult and witchcraft. There are forces beyond our understanding, things mankind is not meant to know. The practice of black magic is truly the work of the devil, James. If you're curious, you may wish to research the history of Byron House. If you do, you'll discover that over 60 years ago, the house was reduced to ashes, with only one casualty. You'll also learn that shortly after Dr. Monroe's house was broken into, a large portion of his private book collection was set on fire in his backyard. Despite investigations, no one was ever caught for these incidents. There were several suspects, of course: disgruntled former employees, ex-inmates, or perhaps even a young orderly studying psychiatry at the University of Manchester. Yet, the police were never able to pin down a culprit. Much time has passed since then, and I no longer possess the sharpness I once did. However, I will recount the events as best I can, and perhaps after hearing them, you'll reconsider your pursuit of this investigation. Once a month, the staff and inmates at Byron House were taken on a trip to the countryside, a reward for good behavior, allowing everyone to enjoy some fresh air. Spencer, of course, was excluded from these trips due to his physical condition. He would typically remain behind with Dr. Monroe while the others went out. However, after Monroe's passing, no staff members were willing to stay behind to attend to Spencer, so instead, a tray of food was left outside his attic door while the rest of the house took a break. I had made it clear that my college studies needed my full attention, and I could no longer work at Byron House. I left shortly after Dr. Monroe passed away and lost contact with Jane, Williams, or anyone else there. Confident that one of my new flatmates in Manchester could vouch for me if necessary, I took the train from Piccadilly to Eastwich, then the last bus to Barton. I waited for the staff and inmates to leave the premises, allowing me to enter unnoticed. With a heavy heart and a troubled mind, I once again ascended the familiar, eerie steps to the attic. By then, the nightmares had returned, now featuring Monroe's tormented spirit crying out from beyond the grave. I fully admit that my mind was likely affected by madness at that point, for what sane person would have done what I did that cold February night? I was convinced that the fate of humanity was hanging in the balance, that Langer, Ugoth, and Carcassa were very real, and that the old ones were patiently waiting in their ancient prisons to rise again. I can't say for sure that I don't still believe those things, but that's a burden I bear, not one that you should. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I stood before the door. At that moment, a voice called to me from beyond. To this day, I cannot tell if the words I heard were real or just a figment of my imagination, but those liquid syllables, slithering and grotesque, spoke to me, and I dared not reply. You done well, the kid mine. I killed him, melted down from the stars. Ritual, soulless nectar offered to the gods, it fed off him. The elder ones feast now. Monroe burns, the body returns. Freedom, your help, you're next. My head was spinning with confusion, and my heart was racing with fear. In a sudden surge of panic, I kicked the door down and beheld what had once been Jonathan Spencer. What I saw is hard to describe accurately, but it was so horrifying that it drove me to flee the attic in a frenzy of madness. I returned with gasoline and matches, convinced that only fire could cleanse the world of this abomination. On the attic floor, a grotesque mass of gelatinous, decaying flesh writhed in a sickening heap, pulsating under its own disturbing weight. Parts of it splattered across the ceiling and walls, but the bulk of it was sprawled across the floor in bubbling pools. Unblinking, swollen eyes rolled aimlessly in the undulating mass, locking onto me with the eerie intensity of a dying star. Limbs and pseudo-limbs grew and shriveled up, only to collapse back into the mass, continuing to squirm and twitch on their own. I believe I saw a face, or at least pieces of one, crawling across the surface of that abhorrent form. It was a grotesque thing, a creation cursed by Langer for over 50 years, a squirming, pulsating blob of meat that mocked and taunted me with the tortured visage of Jonathan Spencer, inmate number 13, the shambler in the attic.